everyone, this is Skylar of Taito Gaming, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about building your first gaming PC. To help you out, just remember that you need 7 basic elements when building a PC. You need a CPU, or central processing unit. You need a GPU, or graphical processing unit. You need RAM, or random access memory, a hard drive, a case, a motherboard, and a power supply. Of course, there's more to that, but that's the basic 7. Just remember you need 7 basic things, and it'll help you remember the basic things you need. Your CPU is very important when doing even basic tasks, and work with the GPU when in game. Just because you bought a $400 GPU, it doesn't mean that you can spend $30 on an AMD Athlon 2 and expect 4K 60 FPS. You have to balance both your GPU and CPU. Your GPU, however, should be your main focus when building a gaming PC. An i5-7600K with the GTX 1080 will theoretically run better than an i7 with a GTX 1050. Your CPU matters, but you need to put more into your GPU while also having the performance from your CPU to prevent bottlenecking. Bottlenecking occurs when you have a very fast component being slowed down by a much slower one. An i5-7600K with the 1060 will perform better than an Athlon 2 with the GTX 1080. Most likely, that really cheap Athlon 2 doesn't have the processing power to keep up with the GTX 1080. This leads to frame drops and even skipping or choppiness. So just remember, a balance between your CPU and GPU is important in gaming PCs, but just remember to lean on spending more on your GPU. Next is your RAM. This is a storage your computer uses to temporarily store memory. So whenever you're loading games and stuff, it uses your RAM. So faster RAM can actually affect your in-game performance. So faster RAM is always a good investment. Just remember that all RAM is not interchangeable. My MSI SLI Plus Z270, which uses a 7th gen i5-7600K, uses DDR4 memory. It won't take older DDR2 or I don't even think DDR3 memory. So just make sure you're using the right kind of RAM as well that your motherboard is compatible with. Capacity wise, 8 gigabytes is still okay in gaming, but games are starting to use a little more than 8 gigs. So now like 12 or 16 might be a wiser long time investment. Or like let's say you have 4 slots, or let's say you have 2 slots on your motherboard. It might be wiser to get a single 8 gig stick than 2 4, because if you get a single stick of 8, you have the ability to get another 8 to add up to 16 later on down the road. Your motherboard is what holds and connects all of your components together. The biggest thing to look at on your motherboard is the form factor, like ATX, Mini ATX, ITX. Those are just the size of the board. The socket type of the board, like I mentioned earlier, the type of RAM it uses. Make sure to look at the form factor when buying a case, because you don't want to buy an ATX size case and then buy an ATX size motherboard and then buy an ITX case, because it won't fit. Also look at how many PCI slots the board has and RAM slots based on how you want to configure your RAM, like I said earlier. Graphics cards in Crossfire for AMD or SLI NVIDIA. That's basically if you have the ability, you have multiple PCI slots, and you want to run, say, 2 1070s together, you can actually use 2 graphics cards from NVIDIA or AMD, they're just named different, together through for NVIDIA it's through a bridge, it's called SLI, but for AMD it's called Crossfire, and if I'm not mistaken, you do not need a bridge for those, and they don't have to be the same graphics cards for AMD, but for NVIDIA you do need the same. You can't do like a 1060 and a 1080 together, but for AMD you can have 2 different graphics cards. Cases are pretty self-explanatory, but the biggest thing to look at is at the form factor of your motherboard. Some other things you might want to look at is like options for cooling down the road and what type of hard drives and how many you can store in the case. So what I mean by cooling is how many like fan slots it has, because like let's say you're looking at a case with fans in the front and fans in the back, but nothing like on the top. Well, if you have, you want a water cooler down the road, maybe that, having the option to put a water cooler on the top of your motherboard might be optimal, but you just want to look at that and think about later on down the road. Next comes the hard drive. There are three main types of hard drives. There's the HDD, which is just a regular spinning hard drive. The SSD, which is much faster. It's the same type of storage that's in like your cell phone. Um, it's much faster, but it's also a little bit more expensive too. Like no, I think 256 gigs of an SSD is like $100, whereas like you can get almost 2 TB of an HDD for like $70. So then there's the SSHD or hybrid drive, which is like in the middle of the HDD and SSD. It shares a capacity for price of the hard drive, the regular hard drive, and some of the performance of the SSD. So it has partitions that are both SSD and HDD in the hybrid drive. A popular configuration for gamers is having a smaller SSD for storing Windows, which will drastically help boot time, and a larger SSHD for storing games and media on. I have a 256 gig boot SSD and a terabyte SSHD for my media and games. Basically, if you put Windows on that 256 gig boot drive or the SSD, it'll improve starting up and just using Windows in regular task. Whereas the SSHD for storing games, because they're getting pretty big now, I've seen games go up to 100 plus gigs, but you don't want to, if you're looking at price performance, SSHDs are really good. As time progresses, components become more efficient, and this can be seen in the 10 series NVIDIA graphics cards. I looked on their website, and the recommended power supply for even a GTX 1070 paired with an i7 is only 400 watts. But that's kind of skimming just by in my eyes, though. I'd say at least a 500 watt power supply, or PSU as it's sometimes called, if you're getting a 1070 up, and a 430 watt power supply for GTX 1060 down. Of course, get a larger power supply if you're planning on using more than one graphics card. So like 750 maybe for two GTX 1070s and an i7, I think. I mean, I wouldn't get above 750 watts unless you're doing some crazy configuration. Let's see. Oh yeah, I was gonna also recommend EVGA if you're looking for price wise. I think like a 500 watt PSU from EVGA on Amazon's like $40. They're not that expensive. And I think a 430 watt EVGA is like 35. I'm not sponsored by them or anything. At the time of making this channel, I literally have like 10 subs, so that's just prior experience with building PCs. I've heard they're pretty good, and from what I've seen, they run pretty good. Now that the parts have been explained, I'll explain now how to put them together. I'm going to go through this pretty slow, and you of course can pause and go back. This is of course how I put my computers together. There's a million and one ways to do this, but this is the way I find easier putting them together. First thing I like to do is go ahead and mount the hard drives in the case, just so they're out of the way, because usually they have their own area to fit them in. They're not in the way anywhere, so I usually go ahead and put those in, because sometimes when you put in like the cooler and stuff, it's kind of hard to install them. So the first thing I like to do is put the hard drives in a case. Not wire them or anything, just go ahead and mount them. After that, with the standoffs, make sure you use your standoffs whenever you're installing the motherboard. Don't try to tighten the motherboard directly to the case, or else you'll end up bending the motherboard. Don't do that. Make sure you use the standoffs whenever installing the motherboard into your case. It might be easier to tilt it sideways when you're putting in your components. After that, I usually install my power supply and go ahead and run the wires to the motherboard. I try to run them behind the motherboard to help with cable management. It looks a lot better, it's a lot cleaner, a lot easier to install other stuff. If your case has a little pocket behind the motherboard where you can run wires. After that, I usually install the RAM. Next, I usually go ahead and install the CPU, It may be best to tilt it sideways so the thermal compound doesn't run down into the board when you're trying to put on the heatsink. That's a problem I ran into on my first PC build. I didn't realize that the stuff ran, and it kind of started going down, so I had to wipe it off and reapply it, and just did it sideways so it'd stay. If you don't have an aftermarket cooler in your case, or if you have an aftermarket cooler and on the back side of your motherboard it doesn't have the hole to mount the brackets onto your motherboard, you may actually have to mount the CPU and cooler before you put the motherboard into the case. After that, install the wires including power and data wires from your hard drive to the motherboard. Don't forget about the front panel cables. Your motherboard manual will have a section on how to arrange those. After that, install the graphics card and plug in the power cables necessary. Some don't require power wires like the 1050 and 1050 Ti. Lastly, installing accessories like lights or extra fans. Installing Windows is really easy nowadays. If you don't have it like a DVD drive, I don't. Google Microsoft. This is what you need to Google. Google Microsoft Windows 10 USB installer. I'll say it again. Google Microsoft Windows 10 USB installer. It'll take you to a Microsoft page, and you can pick out or download the version you need and go ahead and install it on the flash drive. After that's done, plug it into the PC that you just built and turn it on. If it doesn't go directly to the installation, you may need to go into your BIOS, basically the screen that flashes up when you first turn on your computer, and change the it'll be called boot sequence or boot time. It would be something boot sequence, something like that, and allow the your USB drive to boot first. After Windows installs, make sure to install any proper drivers. So like if you have a NVIDIA graphics card, go and install the GeForce Experience so you can go ahead and get the latest drivers. That's just to ensure that everything works properly. From there on, you just use it as any other PC. I hope you enjoyed this video. If I didn't answer any specific questions you might have had, shoot me a tweet at Taito Gaming. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. This is Skylar of Taito Gaming. See you in the next video.